we should do check.
Yeah, I think he may be logging out and back in to check the audio. So this week we've read Maurice Bloch's Moving in and Out of Bodies. And what he's trying to do, this is an article that if my understanding is accurate, it helped inspire David Graeber to write the piece that we read 2 weeks ago on called Beyond the Monastic Self, where he challenges this idea, this false premise of individuation and what constitutes the individual. And so Maurice Bloch does a lengthier intervention where he wrestles with a lot of the same questions. Well, he wrestled first with them and then David afterwards. And the question that he's really trying to ask is, where does the individual begin? Where does the individual end? And what do the sciences have to say about this? And so the piece is, I think, really interesting because he references Durkheim, of course, and historians of religion. He references a lot of anthropologists, but then he also brings in the work by psychologists, neurologists, and people studying distributed cognition. Vassily, would you like to try the audio again?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, that sounds good.
Is it any better? Okay.
Yeah. So I just gave an overview of the article, just basically the title and the purpose, where he's trying to really get at where does the individual begin and end, and can we think of society as something more than just the constituent parts. But if you'd like to say a few things about his Maurice Bloch's work in general, that might be helpful.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so the idea that, you know, society is more than its constituent parts is the central, one of the most famous ideas that was put forward by Emile Durkheim. And what might be interesting in terms of background is that actually, so Bloch was born in France, but he studied and worked in the UK for the most part. In fact, he did most of his career at the London School of Economics. And I was mentioning Durkheim because, in fact, his grandmother's cousin was Marcel Mauss, also Emile Durkheim's nephew. So he never met with Emile Durkheim, but he met with Marcel Mauss when he was a kid, when he was small, but I think I don't think this had too much influence on him, because he was small, and I think at the time he was already interested in anthropology. But most importantly, and this is because I heard what you were saying at the end, you know, the influence of psychology and in particular what they call cognitive psychology, or social psychology, and, you know, this use of experiments, which is quite unusual in anthropology. This can be explained by the fact that his father-in-law was a biologist, and by his own admission, I think this had a very strong influence on him and on his work. And so basically, he's got an anthropology that is very much anchored in science, which is quite unusual in English-speaking anthropology and in anthropology in general. So that might help us to understand, you know, this use of experiments in the chapter that we are reading. So he did his undergraduate, I think, at the LSE, but he did his PhD at Cambridge. And when he was at the LSE, Raymond Firth was like the head of the Department of Anthropology. So it's interesting with Maurice Bloch, because he he studied in he's a British anthropologist really, but because he could speak French, he wrote Claude Lévi-Strauss and understood it, which was not necessarily the case of like other British anthropologists at the time, because it was not yet well translated and so on. So he was very much influenced by Claude Lévi-Strauss as well, very impressed by his work. And Lévi-Strauss at the time was one of the rare anthropologists to conduct some scientific work on human species. One of the few asking questions about what it is to be a human being, how society has been created, what makes us different from other primates. And these sort of questions were not the sort of question that British anthropologists were interested in at the time. So they were more interested in, they were basically first and others at the LSE at the time were moving towards sociology. So, for example, they were interested in kinship, which is something he mentioned in this paper. And kinship was viewed by them as a system that creates solidarity in the societies they were looking at. Bloch is also interesting for me because he's also interested in the nature of the state, which is not something that Lévi-Strauss, for example, was caring much about. And this can also be connected to his political fights, in particular against colonialism, and these fights have marked his work quite significantly. In his PhD work, for example, he stressed the importance of Christianism on politics and rituals in contemporary Madagascar, which was quite unusual at the time because most anthropologists, especially the French one in Madagascar, they were very much tied to the colonialist power, and were not very interested in these kind of issues. So I'm getting to David Graeber as well, because I've just said it. Maurice Bloch is interested in Madagascar. So he did most of his field work in Madagascar, which is one of the similarities with David Graeber. So David Graeber wrote and commented Maurice Bloch quite a lot, and criticized him also quite a lot in his book on value. For example, I remember the last chapter is very much. He's quite a fierce critic of Bloch about his analysis of what they call the Hasina in Madagascar, and basically he's basically saying that Maurice Bloch had it completely wrong and didn't see magic because the reason being that he was not really interested in magic because he was a Marxist, and Marxists didn't really care about magic. I just wanted to say, I may be a bit too long, but just something that, talking about the similarities with David Graeber, I think there is something interesting to say about their approach, their anthropological approach in general. Most of the time, anthropologists, they conduct, the way they conduct their business is basically, it's either they look at very small groups of people, which are isolated from capitalist world, and they look at, they try to interpret the way people look at the world and how they organize themselves. So this is one of the way to do anthropology, and the other is to devise great general theories. about behaviors, about ways of thinking and being, and trying to look at, trying to reflect on humanity in more general terms. And what Maurice Bloch and also David Graeber try to do is precisely to try to look at both hands at the same time. And I think this is quite present. I mean, this kind of approach is quite visible in the chapter that we wanted to read and discuss today. Thank you. Steve, do you want to continue facilitating?
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. So he starts with the premise that there's an indeterminacy concerning the physical boundaries of individuals. So he takes this to mean that humans don't end at the skin. And even though he acknowledges being a literal thinker, he suggests that there's something to that idea, especially when one looks at research being done by neuroscientists and activities going on in the brain. And so he ends up concluding, one of his initial conclusions is that humans, that they go in and out of each other's bodies. And we can think of this in a very literal way when it comes to sex and birth. We literally go in and out of each other's bodies. But he says that science is increasingly finding that this is not merely a facet of biology, but that of the nervous system as well. And that when we look at brain activity, we find that humans strive to adjust their minds to be in harmony with the minds of others. And he calls this a desire to share intentionality. And from this idea of shared intentionality, this for him, for Bloch, I think it's a primal sort of urge, and that they want to establish a theory of mind. So he spends second half of the article really talking quite a bit about theory of mind, which he describes as a kind of mind reading that makes complex communication possible. So theory of mind is an idea going way back in psychology to the early 20th century that basically states that developmentally, infants, as they develop and as their prefrontal cortex develops, they become more capable of imagining what other people are thinking. And so they're able to imagine the intentionality that others might have, and that what they believe might be shared by others, but it might not be shared. And that there's a mutual mind that Bloch uses. He says at best it's a metaphor, and at worst it's a mystification. But he's nonetheless interested in seeing how that kind of process, this mental process, is itself a material process that requires neuronal organization, the resemblance of neuronal organization. And that this is a kind of distributed cognition that's not bounded by the skin. And so children developmentally will subconsciously assume that everyone knows what they know, but in certain psychological experiments, one can do, for instance, a false belief task where some people are privy to what is known and some other people aren't privy to what is known. And the classic example is the candy under the hat, where you have two hats, one of which has candy under it, and you show that to the children, and then you have someone, you then have someone leave, and then you show the candy and you move it so that the audience now is aware which one has the candy, but the person who's absent isn't. And then you ask the children, when the person returns, where will that person guess the candy is? And developmentally, children will reach a point where 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds will respond, oh, the person's going to guess wrongly because they don't know that the candy's been switched, whereas the kids will assume that the person will guess where the candy originally was, in part because they maybe assume that people don't lie. So he uses this experiment in Madagascar to suggest that people in Madagascar have a very similar kind of theory of mind from people in the advanced capitalist, so-called advanced capitalist world, and that that these sorts of distinctions, according to theory of mind, that if we share this as humans, this theory of mind, that becomes basically the first step in human communication, that this kind of step is necessary. When I read the piece, I've done reading in theory of mind, some of the psychology, because my son has autism spectrum disorder, and so theory of mind is an idea that it's been argued that people on the autism spectrum have a delay in developing theory of mind. And so I read this with some concern, because what I'm curious and would love to hear thoughts about is, I can't tell if Bloch is trying to say that theory of mind is sort of like the basis of what distinguishes us as primates, as humans rather, or if he's saying that theory of mind is more a continuum, where it's not, one doesn't have theory of mind or doesn't have it, it's one falls somewhere on this continuum of theory of mind, as they age, as they become socialized. And so that was one of the thoughts that I had about just his theory. I really like the idea of theory of mind being this essential step to human communication. But where I'm really curious is, how then does one account for people on the autism spectrum where theory of mind doesn't develop in these typically neurodevelopmentalist ways? And so I do wonder if he's in critiquing these sorts of evolutionistic assumptions, if he's perhaps succumbing to one. But I don't want to be unfair to his interpretation, because it's quite possible that he considers theory of mind a continuum rather than you either have it or you don't have it. That was really my main takeaway from the article, where if he were here, that's what I would want to ask him.
Do we have any comments, any questions about the text?
If nobody wants, yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
No.
So Steve, about people on the autism spectrum, I mean, I was reading it more that there is a continuum, but individuation is a process, and I think Graeber is mentioning it, that never ends. And so maybe the people on the autism spectrum are in a more natural state than the rest of us, because of the power of society is so powerful in the violence of socialization. I don't know. That was just what was occurring to me with they might be the more natural developments as opposed to lockstep individuation.
Yeah, one of the things that I like about the article is he toward the end, this is on page 295, he says that ideologies of individualism are always negated by ideologies based on the realization of interconnection. What I like about that is he sees individualism as an ideology. And so it is something that happens to us. But just as the realization of interconnection is also something that happens to us. And what I find most fascinating is the way that seeing these as ideologies, they're ideologies, so but they happen through material processes. And so there's a material element to it. Even though it's an ideology, it's one that happens through some kind of social substance, some kind of coming together of people or of power, and that it nonetheless is an empirical phenomenon. And so it's something that's actually occurring, even though it may have mystifying properties. And so it's simultaneously, like he says on I don't remember what page this was, but where he talks about mutual mind reading is both metaphor and mystification. It can work both ways. Separating the two is probably the distinguishing between the two is the difficult part, I imagine.
I had a follow-up question to Mark. I didn't quite get what you mean by a more natural state. So natural as opposed to social, or what do you mean under natural?
I'm not quite sure, Zina, but something unnatural would be something we'd have to work towards. And so sort of a default state might be one that resists in individualization. And I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, but I think it's also a question how we think of evolution when applied for the humans. And I think it's very fundamental because in a way humans influence more than anybody else the way evolution is happening, because we transform the environment much more than any other species. But because of that, I don't understand what is more natural, because I mean, yeah. So when we are talking about natural, as if we think that there is an authentic nature somewhere where there are some authentic human species. And yeah, I'm not sure, but it's interesting.
I don't want to speak for Mark, but I guess the question I would maybe think of like individualization is more of a false construct regardless, that we've, society builds up in our heads. And I don't know if there's like maybe there's other constructs that are more, that overlay on actual human nature better, that don't miss out things. And I think like true false logic is a construct in my mind, but not everything fits into being true and false. We want it to, but there is true, false, and unknown. And there's cultures that think about things as being true, false, and unknown. And there's cultures that think about things as being true and false. And I would argue that true, false, and unknown is more reflective of reality. So that's actually a transition also to the question I have of, I grew up in a very individualist country. I can see my kids, individuate themselves, but like, what does that look like if you're not in that construct? Is my question. What it like in a practical way? Like, what is that? And the kind of the materialist in me gets a little hesitant when things get too like mystical, but there's also like loosey-goosey mystical, and there's actual motor mirror neurons firing that make us like have empathy for people, and we understand things for people. So like, what is that like communal collectivist kind of socially situated, I don't know, construct look like in practice or feel like in practice? I don't know if any of you have answers, unless there's, someone who studied the anthropological, existence of that, but that's my general question. What does that look like?
I'm sure there are interesting studies about twins and how they develop their individuality, but I know that there are these studies, but I have nothing to say. But if somebody knows, it would be also interesting. Because it's also a question like what you understand under cultural. Of course, there are institutional things, there are social things, but I think twins is an interesting phenomenon in the sense that it's a very immediate human alter ego.
Yeah, I actually had a friend who was researching twins in Seattle University. She was working in genetic department or something like that, and she was describing some kind of mystical things, like they were studying the separate twins that were separated by birth, and then they met when they were like 60 years old, and they like had the same attitude toward clothes or food, and they grew up in a very different environment, so on. But if I understand correctly, Matt, he was more talking about social makeup, like a social construct, yeah, like if it's individualism as an ideology, then how practically can look situations in which the different ideology applied. And I think for me, this new book of David is like a catalog, a parade of these different settings, because it could be very different, obviously. And so the major belief is like they exist simultaneously right now, like different type of the settings. And one of the freedom, as Steve was talking yesterday, but also in general, is like our capacity and belief that we can change them ourselves. So we basically can decide which one is we kind of desire, or which one is more just, or whatever other criteria we have. But it's like, come back to the twins, it's something in between a biology, something that's like predetermined, as like autism, or having a twin, or like neurons, how they construct, in us being the primates, and this freedom of making a decision of what basically social design we find more attractive or just, and want to construct ourselves or try to construct ourselves. So, and that's probably always in a balance, something like that, or in a fight. That's at least how I feel about that. But I want to also ask question, because we were talking about Plato and Hannah Arendt and the Greeks, and their idea of concept of society and the individual inside of this society. And of course, Greeks are like famous for developing this ideology of heroes, that saving the polis, or in general, like really, you know, this idea of fame and gymnasium and Olympic Games and all of that. And the idea of politics, of being like a political hero, of contributing individually, how to, in the way how the society would be changed. And in the same time, they're all about dialogue, and about kind of developing the ideas together, and that's democracy. So I just was trying to, like, yeah, I just want to hear your opinion. Do you think it's a real difference between this universe of Greek universe, kind of very vulgar saying that, like the cosmos, that's very hierarchical with heroes that are gods and humans, and let's say indigenous universe, where, like, you know, we all like Dinka people collectively creating something together. So if it's some contradictory ideas or social designs that cannot be combined, or like really really kind of yeah, not contradictory to each other, or not.
Well, I maybe can say something. I don't have an immediate answer, but as far as I remember the Greek mythology and the history of Greek literature, classic literature. So the idea of individual in Greek culture also changed quite considerably, like from the archaic times to classic times. And let's say if they in the early Greek dramas, gods live in a separate world, and basically they decide about the fates of the humans, and humans are just I don't want to say victims, but they are basically they are not quite subjects of their life. Then the late Greek tragedy is already a tragedy where basically kind of gods and heroes and humans interfere, and they have like complex psychological drama. And so we can talk about the process of individuation in this sense. So it's not a flat human animal ontology, but it's still a quite different system compared to the early stages. And I'm pretty sure that for many indigenous people, we just don't have a chance to observe this transformation, because I mean, this mythology has been collected at some point in time by some ethnographers or folklorists, and then we see it and interpret it as static and hermeneutic, although it's probably not the case.
I think if I were looking at the Greeks, I'd want to look at the early Greeks as well. It's a project I've never quite managed to do or carry out, but the pre-Socratics were different in some ways. And they were different in interesting ways, and in some ways more shamanic. And there's also Greek influences and exchanges with the people to the east. So I think it's a fascinating area, but there may be more than one answer.
That also, that period from when the sort of Greek philosophy that Western civilization now sort of traces back to its origin, is part of that process of defining how we are individuals in some way and rooting that in logic. So that's kind of part of the process by which this conversation of people going in and out of each other is attempting to undo. I wanted to just kind of comment to Steve, maybe like the idea of a theory of mind, making a distinction between maybe whether people have a theory of mind, right? Somebody has a theory that somebody else is thinking something or doing something or feeling something, and the qualities of that theory of mind. Because if I understood autism right, it's not that they don't have a theory of mind, it's not that they don't have a thing, it's just that it's harder to understand, to identify particular emotions. So their theory of mind isn't sophisticated in a particular way, but again, when you say it's not, when one says it's not sophisticated in a particular way, I think like, you know, maybe that's like if just because certain people have very clear skills at emotions and other people don't, that just, I mean, if you had a lot of people who didn't have clear skills and emotions, you would have a society develop that would be done differently. And those people wouldn't be any less than us. Sometimes that it is. So look, by thinking about theory of mind as the qualities of it, then you can come up with a bit more specific about this. And the idea of a theory of mind, of course, is that someone else is someone else, which is sort of to say they're an individual that's different from us. But you can have theories of mind, presumably, that don't see us different in particular ways. I don't think it's like this, the idea of, well, we're all either individuals or we're all some kind of collective mind. What happens is there's somewhere in between where people feel I share some things, but I pretty much understand that if someone grabs my friend and twists their arm behind their back, they're going to feel pain, not necessarily me, but I'll think about that. But I might, because they're my comrade, feel that I'm being attacked or we're being attacked. You know, those are, I think that's some of the distinctions that we probably want to try to draw out from that. I was quite interested, one, if what Steve was saying about what was going on page 295, and then if anybody knew, because that's also the page that he brings in stuff about whatever the your man who does philosophy of religion in the 19th century, the Durkheim. And I was just interested in if anybody is good at Durkheim. I'm supposed to be much better at Durkheim than I actually am, but I didn't know if anyone had anything comment on that.
Actually, David has a lecture about Durkheim that on video, and when I come back from the US, I think I will just put all these lectures, and maybe we can also have some strange reading groups where we first, like, you know, watch the video or then discuss it instead of reading. But it was one on Durkheim. I would just not take. I don't have enough chutzpah to summarize it.
I actually wanted Mitya to come to talk about that, because he actually taught a course on Durkheim this year. But what is it specifically you want to know, Michael, on Durkheim?
Yeah, just I mean, just in terms of what is the argument here about like Durkheim had a theory of if I remember right, the collective self and solidarity and these types of things, which a lot of modern sociology has kind of moved away from because of, but in part that's Durkheim's method is Durkheim's theory of a book on suicide is the kind of paradigm for modern sociology, which is like to apply statistics and say why people do things. And Durkheim's reasoning was kind of the collective human, but modern sociology oftentimes eliminates the idea that people have agency and just explains them without, as if they were the function of statistics. They were, controlled by a structure. And so it's a hard thing to do because obviously people are affected by the sort of structures they are. So, but they also make choices. So I was just interested in, because I've kind of always grown up as Durkheim bad in those kind of simplistic ways in which you learn social theorists early. But so I was interested in if people knew how Durkheim relates to this argument of, and where sort of free will and choice fits into these types of things.
Well, it'd be interesting to see what David Graeber has to say about that, because it seems to me that so he doesn't use Durkheim very much in his work at all, and it's also, Michael, I think, for the reason you've indicated, because the way he explains the creation of society is very wanting. It's not very satisfying, and many like Bruno Latour and Michel Calon criticized him, and this is kind of the starting point of their actor network theory. And I think most of the things that the way we read Durkheim now is through the lens of these people, through the lens of Michel Foucault as well, who didn't like Durkheim very much. Yeah, I'd be interesting to see what David had to say about that. Although, really, I don't think Durkheim appears very often. The name of Durkheim appears very often in his work. Is much more interested in his nephew Marcel Mauss, who as he said, was really asking the right questions.
Yeah, it wasn't an all lecture about Durkheim. Durkheim was a part of the lecture. And I think you and Mitya were the same lecture where I filmed it. I don't know. Have you been, when did you study, Vassily? Because Mitya, I think, was in the same last year group where I was filming the lectures.
So you're referring to his course on the Anthropology of Value?
Yeah.
At the LSE. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
But then, Michael, can I ask you again? So, am I understood you correctly that you referred to the Greeks not as just this vast period that, of course, was very different, but in the golden age, when actually the very idea of this individual who is, center of the universe were born, that we are referred now. So all what we use is like this individual free man and democracy as this free man who is deciding together, making decisions of how police is supposed to live. And I do know that, like I said last time, I'm thinking about that. So David was very suspicious about the whole setup, saying that the police policy and politeness is coming from the same root. The very idea of this individual, like a citizens of republic, is very questionable. And yeah, I just wonder, what do you think? How, like, okay, maybe in the connection with Malagasy society that Bloch is referring, what is the difference between these two? Maybe Steve, you can answer.
I mean, I'm not very good on this, and certainly the ancient Greeks, but like it does seem like in order that everyone will have a theory of mind, that's just to say other people are thinking something, and qualitatively you might have a theory of mind that kind of shows, that links you much more carefully to other people, and you might have a theory of mind that doesn't link you. And when you have it's not so much individuation per se as particular types of individuation, right? It would be like if you have a patriarchal framework of, the people feel these things in a way that is divorced from other people, then you have like a theory of a hero and a fighter. If you grow up in a war-like society and you support like the hero who can kill other people, then your theory of people is going to be much more, is going to be, your theory of mind is going to be qualitatively different, I think. And so to me, I see it as the idea that of the monastic self type philosophy, or a patriarchal hero type philosophy as being more about, I don't have to care about other people, and that's and so then my theory of mind is affected by that, which doesn't mean I don't think somebody else doesn't have a separate mind and thinks. And it doesn't mean if I was less patriarchal that I would think, oh my goodness, we're all one continuum of one mind, because obviously most people understand that, yeah, we're connected, but we also work and think separately. So that's, I would think along those lines. I think there's probably obviously people who knew more about the Greeks and knew more about the various differentiations of culture, which you could make finer distinctions than I would be making here. Don't know if that's helpful.
Nika, are you referring to because David Graeber actually has a paper about anti-heroic societies, and he gives the example of the Malagasy society. Say it again.
Can you name this paper? So maybe that's.
It's the paper. I don't remember the name. It's about creative refusal.
Creative refusal. Yeah, that's what Simone did. Yeah.
So in this paper, he put forward this idea that I think this is a key idea. And I think he takes it from most that like cultures, they don't live in isolation. They've been in contact with each other forever, and this is where he brings this concept by someone we don't really read anymore. His name is Gregory Bateson. He's an anthropologist and cybernetist, and he, in cybernetics, there is this idea that, it's not the relationship between one culture and the other. It's one culture, the other, and the environment. And I think this is the key idea that I think we should get rid of this idea that we can actually look at things in isolation. And this is, I think, the argument that Maurice Bloch also makes in this chapter, although at another level, if you want, because he's basically saying, it's actually difficult to talk about individuals. What is an individual? I was watching a documentary yesterday where they were talking about our stomach. I don't know if you knew that, but our stomach is actually full of neurons, and it is basically our second brain. And if you want to go further than that, it's actually our first brain, because initially, if we take this evolutionary perspective, at the beginning, we, living creatures were just like a living stomach, and the brain, that the mind and basically the individual is something that came much later. So what is the individual? Is it the brain, or is it like the brain plus our stomach, or is it the brain plus our stomach plus smartphone, which is also what Bruno Latour is basically saying. And when we say that, we're like, oh, we add a device and we can actually look at assemblage of different things. You have like you have a man and a non-human, and it makes a lot of sense. But like many people are kind of agree with this idea. But like when you start saying that actually we are we are actually corporate individuals. We are. You actually makes sense to talk about like a connection between two minds. All of a sudden, you become a little bit more like mystical and sounds and scientific. And this is actually, I mean, that's actually quite interesting. I think this is the idea, that the fact that we should not look at things in isolation. That is really key in both papers that we've been reading in the last two sessions.
Do you, Vassily, have a recommendation how to get of like where to start with Gregory Bateson? I've heard of him and I've been wanting to read something. I'm not sure where to start. Some of his work's kind of hard to find actually. But do you have a recommendation of where to start?
So to be honest, I'm actually reading it at the moment because I'm trying to write write something about him. But most of the things I've read so far are secondary, sources. I can put some of. I'll send you an email and I'll send you the papers that I've found important.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you.
I think as Monica just said in the chat, Steps to an Ecology of Mind is. I must have read it a couple of times at various points. Oh, there's Mind. Yeah, there's Mind and Nature as well. Yes, I've forgotten that one. But what actually struck me earlier when we were mentioning autism, because again, I have a daughter with an official diagnosis of autism. I may have some of the traits myself. Is one of the things I've learned is that discussions about autism are more interesting when autistic people are involved, particularly when they think there's no one around who is going to other them. And then you can get very accurate descriptions of mental states and comparisons. And it's quite fascinating. Look, there might be an anthropological lesson there as well, but one of the most interesting conversations I had was a random one at a wedding with someone, and we're discussing our children, their health problems, and mentioned my daughter. And it turned out the woman I was talking to and myself, we both studied mathematics at university. And we thought, we were quite used to participating in groups with markedly different levels of autism, because there's a lot of it in mathematics students. And the discussions always go better when people aren't othering the people with the condition. But again, we then had an interesting conversation. We thought that we both had some traits of it, and our social skills had developed a few years later than our age group. I thought I was much better at some things in my middle 20s than my early 20s. And I can see very similar things in my daughter as well, that she's now 31 or 32. And it's interesting over the years watching skills develop. So I'm always very wary of people who rush in to say that all people with autism do and don't have certain characteristics, because the more you talk to them, the more you realize how diverse it is. And I think also because it produces obsessiveness and quite a lot of mathematics and science, it does have some survival value in an evolutionary sense. The other thing that actually, again, I agree with Matt about the racism, but it's hard to tell being white. But it's also one of the things that struck me reading this paper, or possibly the first time I read it some time ago, is that if I'd read it when I was 20, I'd have understood it, but it actually, to engage with it, as with Durkheim or many of them, many anthropologists, requires a certain amount of detachment from the ideas of society around. And that's quite a challenge when you come out of a background when saying most of these things would expose you to ridicule or attack, both at, say, school and home. And I do wonder that when this links to the point about not separating earlier, when you move into this sort of discussion, which is quite fundamental about the nature of religion or so on, it's helpful to know what assumptions of social class people are bringing to the discussion. Or there may be shared assumptions which are shared by half of the discussion, but not others, not thinking of the people here. But I think my sense, again, when I was 20, would be that engaging with this material, I've been never quite sure when I was going to be attacked. So anyway, I'll leave it at that, but it's all fascinating.
Yeah, thank you for that, Robin. It reminds me of how Maurice Bloch starts the essay. I love this passage. It's the anthropologist's exorcism prayer. I humbly acknowledge that everything I say is nothing but an epiphenomenon of my present cultural position in time, and that this inevitably leads me to essentialize a particular cultural position and then mercilessly impose it on defenseless people. Yeah, that's such a wonderful way to begin an article.
Yes, I wouldn't have put it quite as strongly as that, but I agree with the general sentiment.
It is interesting, though. He's in some ways he's going back and forth between, because that's part of his saying, oh, I'm going to use science, and people don't use science in anthropology, right? And then he goes back to, and you think, oh, here's this guy, he's just going to be another one of those scientist types who says, I've got the truth and this is objectivity. And then he moves from that to to something else. So it's a very back and forth position to try to create a nuance in this idea that between an absolute sort of social constructivism where it's just your opinion, your cultural, every culture is different, and what you think is what you think, and it's no less true than stuff, and the idea of the science, which is there's one right answer, and this is the realism, right, of science, for example. Two, well, people have, there is something in the world which we share, but we can't necessarily say interpret it in a specific way. But it is out there by itself, and you can, and in some cases you can, it will, you can interpret it somewhat, but like it will interpret itself if I'm not saying that very well, but they'll joke about the people who come to the elephant and they say, what is an elephant like? And they've never seen an elephant, but that the three blind men, and that one grabs the trunk. Oh, an elephant's like an elephant is like a python because it's very long. And another grabs the leg of the elephant and says an elephant is like a trunk of a tree because it's very big and thick. And another gets the tail of the elephant. Oh, an elephant is smelly and it's horrible, right? And they have three different interpretations, and people will come and say, oh, they're all just equally true. Well, the two things we could say about this is, one is the elephant impacts people's interpretation, right? So it's not, and if you went more, when the interpretation has power, it actually impacts the elephant as well. You know, some people will have interpreted elephants and say elephants are marvelous creatures, they never forget, and they have this long life, and they're interesting as animals. Somebody else will have interpreted elephants as they're great to big game to hunt them. And so those interpretations actually change the elephant. One kills elephants and the other celebrates them. So, but like the interpretation isn't necessarily objective simply because someone has power over the elephant and says an elephant can be shot. So I don't know if that's useful, but like trying to find that piece of between science as an objective knowledge where one person can say, I did an experiment and this is the truth, and an utter cultural relativity that doesn't pay attention to the thing that is out there that people are discussing. So somewhere between those. And that is like a conversation in some ways, but in the conversation, the things that you are doing the science about are in that conversation. So in this case, it's the people and their brains that talk and interact with each other is the bit of the science that he wants to talk about.
I think objectivity is really just a cluster of shared subjectivity, which is why I tend to be wound up by people who talk about the objective facts.
Yeah,
Yes, you can try and
exactly. It's
yeah.
a cluster of shared objectivity, shared subjectivity, and to the point that a bunch of those people think that the only type of subjectivity that's valid is theirs, and here's the method to create it, and then they impose that, right? That's why I find the realism as a kind of form of violence, really.
In a way, this is, I think, like the central question of the science and technology studies. Like when doing the critiques of concepts like race or, I don't know, sex or whatever, and then by showing how we first kind of construct this elephant, as you say, and then this elephant gains his own life, and then of course we keep categorizing other things according to the concept that we ourselves created, but we lose track. We kind of we already take them for granted as scientific facts. And in a way, this conversation, by the way, kind of can be traced back to Durkheim and his social facts. So I think that if we're looking for the value of Durkheim in this conversation, it's really in kind of in suggesting that yeah, indeed, like when many people share certain ideas, then these ideas acquire power. And then so this he called it social facts, but it's about epistemic power. Yeah, and then it was just kind of developed in different ways in different traditions. So like Foucault suggests one way to understand this power, and the authors who worked with like nations or imaginative communities, they kind of took a different aspect of it. But implicitly, I think Durkheim is present in this conversation. He's just more interested not in this interpersonal relation and communication, but rather on a more collective level.
Yeah, and Bloch ends up acknowledging his similarities to Durkheim. On 297, he says that much of what I have said is what he, Durkheim, said long ago, though from a totally different epistemological base. And so he goes on, and for this reason, it is also essential to stress the profound difference between his argument and my own. And for Bloch, the critical distinction is the causation of what is causing people to create a culture. And yeah, I don't know Durkheim, but Bloch seems to suggest that Durkheim succumbs to an idealistic fantasy about religion, whereas Bloch is really trying to show that this has neurological bases. And so, yeah, it is fascinating to me, at least it's fascinating that they've reached similar conclusions, but from completely opposite ends of the philosophical continuum between materialism and idealism.
It's so fascinating. I will try to find this lecture, and maybe we can kind of write down and make a further research of Durkheim, because that's a fundamental question of how society constructed and what should we do being part of that.
Yeah, because it seems like what Bloch is saying, and I think David Graeber, I mean, this I think is the crux of his work, is that the problems arise when if we use a concept like individual and we use a concept like society, we shouldn't use those as opposites, but we shouldn't use them clearly as one and the same, because that's what liberalism does. And so the example of the coral reef, I think, is especially apt, that all of it's coral, but a particular piece of it could be coral. So the individual is society. The society is made up of individuals, but there are these ideologies of individualism and collectivism that are operating it, in specific ways as a result of cultural context.
I'd like to just ask a question of what people thought of Bloch's idea of trust. That is, let's say my individuality doesn't end with me, but I trust the other parts of my mind to go forth. I mean, and that's where I think he was getting closer to the religious idea again. And also with the distributed cognition. So these ideas that I have things that can help my mind that are outside of me. And then when Vassily was saying the iPhone, I thought, well, I don't really necessarily trust my iPhone, but I'm, with other people, whenever we're thinking together, I think we are trusting each other. So there's this idea of trust.
Can I reply to that? I think it goes back also to what Emile Durkheim was saying. So one of his important theses is that it's about solidarity, and he's got this typology of two types of solidarity. One is organic. This is the kind of this is a kind of solidarity that you find in our society, which are quite big, and where you need a certain division of labor. Some degree of division of labor. So this is basically what he's talking about when Maurice Bloch takes this example of the big boat, with these different people doing small tasks and creating some common intelligence. This is Hutchins' argument about this. How does he call it? Like distributed cognition. I'm not sure about the term. I think this is it. And you have this organic solidarity, which is very much the kind of thing that you find in small groups, where everybody's kind of the same. You don't need any division of labor. I don't think David Graeber would be he's actually making an argument against that in his last book with Wengrow. But yeah, I think trust in that specific chapter written by Bloch is what he call this everyday solidarity.
I would maybe also add that I think there is a kind of there is an assumption of an individual incompleteness. So we cannot understand like 100% because we are not completely like 100% equal or coherent, but we can rely, so we can trust in the sense that rely on the experience of the others, to reach a certain common understanding. And I think that it's also interesting that this kind of trust somehow, I don't want to say equals, but it's somehow resonate with other people's experience. And and certain idea about other people's needs and intentionalities. But it's tricky, but it's interesting.
One question I have is about how much Bloch actually influenced David Graeber's work. I've always been impressed by the way he could he could look at so many disciplines at the same time, and you find in his work mention of Piaget's work, of Vygotsky, and it's all these. I wonder if he's actually coming from Bloch, because Bloch is, this is something I didn't say in the introduction. He's also the founder of one of the founders of what we call cognitive anthropology, and this is the anthropology that uses social psychology experiments, and David Graeber does that as well. He wrote this book about value, and this is a book that didn't create much debate, but years later they did a special issue in the O about value, and some people commented on his book, and he replied to them in a paper called "It is Value that." It is values that bring universe into being, or I'm not sure about the title, but it's something like that. And what's interesting is that he basically explained the main idea of his theory by using the Stanford experiment. And I just find it interesting how social psychology is so important in his work, so present. No, Nika, the influence, because I mean, we could actually ask Maurice.
Yeah, we can. We just need to create a correct framework. Maurice Bloch is a person for the public lecture, so maybe we can do it like far in advance and make it real public, not the private one. That will make sense.
Yeah, I wonder, just Vassily, I don't know the answer to your question, obviously, but though just the other thing that David seemed to be good at doing is engaging in the big debates, and social psychology was a way of framing a lot of the big debates, because it took the questions of human nature and reduced them to a scientific experiment that could be claimed to have objectivity. And then people would all then have to agree. And it's not necessarily bad that people all have to agree. And a lot of scientific experiments do create answers that are quite, seem pretty accurate because they're repeatable in many ways and stuff. So by engaging, maybe he just wanted to engage with those because they were the big debates, whether or not he thought that method was always the most important. I don't know.
Well, I think Maurice Bloch definitely, there is this naturalist approach in his work, where I think he basically conducted these experiments because he really think that they create facts, as opposed to, the lot of, because there is a lot of chit chat about what people think, if they really think that, if they really believe in their rituals and so on. And I think his aim in conducting these experiments is precisely to do that, to create facts, social facts.
I also can imagine that one of his goals is to kind of to foster or to enable the dialogue between biology and anthropology, because indeed it's a problem that this dialogue became quasi impossible and from both sides. I used to work 3 years ago in a project on a particular branch of evolutionary biology called extensive evolutionary synthesis. And so these are evolutionary biologists trying to kind of put an emphasis not on genes, but rather on other quasi-social aspects, such as the communication between species and environment, and mutual shaping and reshaping of species and environment. Or, for example, also the transformation of morphology as a result of the transformation of the environment. And there are different aspects, and it's so although these are like the two leaders of this let's say branch are quite well established professors, having so to say little social risks or reputational risks, they still have experienced quite strong attacks from the community, and it has been a big scandal. And at the end of the day, one of them who works in Great Britain didn't get like the regular university grant, which was usually which has never been a problem, so it was a kind of a default option, and they finally got funding from the Templeton Foundation, which has a reputation of quite like esoteric or quite a special funding structure. But they accepted it because they thought that well, their goal is important, and so basically they funded also a lot. It was a rare case when biologists funded some philosophers of science or some social scientists, because they also needed to create a meta discourse about what's going on and why there is such a resistance for this kind of conversation in biology. But I found it very interesting also because I attended at least 3 quite big conferences where this whole issue has been discussed. And it was interesting to observe how much resistance exists also within the community for different reasons, and how people are sometimes afraid to be affiliated with this branch, although in fact their research resonates with the ideas of this branch. And so I know it from the anthropology side, and it was interesting to see it from the biological side. And maybe the last thing maybe is also what was interesting is that indeed they put an important emphasis on human evolution, and this is something very unusual for the evolutionary theory, because usually human evolution is like, if it is present at all in the handbook, then it's the last chapter, the shortest one and the quickest one, because it's the most kind of dangerous aspect in terms of conclusions.
Well, thank you. Maybe we can hear before we wrap this up. Maybe we can hear people we didn't hear before, or if not, one last comment about the text to conclude by someone who already said something. I was reading in the introduction to, because it was, so it got republished in the O, but they don't really explain why they republished it. The only thing they say is that it gave, this specific paper gave rise in anthropology about you know, a lot of, like, some literature on the notion of opacity, but the term opacity doesn't appear in the paper, so I don't really know what they mean here. I'm not actually aware of this debate in anthropology. So shall we conclude? Well, thank you everyone for coming, and maybe we can. When is the last session, Nika? The next one, sorry. When is the next one?
I think in the week after next. So we're doing every 2 weeks.
Yeah. So what do we want to talk about? Last time we mentioned Bhaskar.
Yeah.
So shall we look for We can actually do it in the form of a public lecture, this one, because we had someone who could.
Yeah, the guy who's, yeah, we can write to the person who devoted to help Bashkar out. And maybe if we will have some projects to have published in the Museum of Care framework, we can then publish. Yeah. But I would be now interested to, I don't remember if I read it actually, but this article about creative refusal, that's what would be interesting for me, but I don't know if other people would be interested.
Yeah, great paper. Yeah, I'd be happy to discuss that. It's actually also, I don't really know how the book with Wengro came about. But in this paper, he basically, well, it's one of the main ideas of the book. And he actually, I think in this paper, he says that David Wengro is the most amazing archaeologist of the time, and and I think as I imagine that the partnership was born from that.
Yeah, I think he was saying that, finally he gets like the amazing archaeologists who can back up all of these ideas. So nobody would say that, it's just his invention, but it true happens 30,000 years ago. And so on. So it's like a military attack on the picture of the world that we have now. It should be destroyed and rearranged. That's, I believe, will be. So I'm sure it will be total victory.
So shall we go for that, or any other ideas? Maybe do you have any suggestions on something we can read in 2 weeks? And after that, I think the curators from Milan are going to have a reading group on Nietzsche.
29, yeah. Yeah.
And then later on, Simona is going to introduce ideas, Spinoza's ideas and things. But we'll
that creative resistance paper sounds good. If other people think, I was just curious about the Roy Bhaskar, because I would love to do that. I just don't know Roy Bhaskar's work very well, or what would be the kind of key papers to read, and maybe that's why we haven't done Roy Bhaskar, because no one has what would be the introductory paper. But if no one knows that, I could try to go and research Roy Bhaskar and figure out the critical realism stuff, because the critical realism is basically the Marxist version of science and technology studies. And the science and technology studies was the kind of always to hold realism at a distance, that no one could say what, even if there was something reality out there, no one was supposed to talk about it in the sense of say, this is reality, because you didn't have a vantage point that could speak from all places. But what the Marxism kind of holds is very distinct. Well, we're fine with being a bit relative and all that, but we definitely don't want to let go of the fact that there is a capitalist process that is causing all these problems, whereas science and technology studies got accused of not always dealing with that because it's part of those types of politics. But I mean, and it's, so it'd be really interesting to talk about all of those, but maybe that's longer down the road when we have a little bit more research to figure out what would be the good thing to read.
I think we can maybe organize a dialogue between it's some person, I forget his name, who is like enthusiastically trying to promote Roy Bhaskar, and Yash Lat was pointing out, like he pointed out on him, he's online somewhere. So maybe we can invite him in the Museum of Care, and maybe Michael, you can facilitate an interview with him first, like a lecture, introduction, interview, and then a reading list and something like that, and we can do it in advance, like November, let's say, so we have time to contact him and to promote this so more people will come, because that's a kind of an effort to organize it well. So what do you think about this?
Okay, I'm certainly willing to help out with that. Yeah, sounds good.
Great. So yeah, and it's much more comfortable format for me to be in a smaller group and read something like, yeah, I just like for me, Steve, I just need a small pieces of text to, you know, like anything beyond like 15 pages is very difficult, even 15 pages every week on top of everything else is a challenge.
Yeah, this sounds great. I like the idea of reading the creative refusal piece, because I think it will help us get a sense of how Roy Bhaskar's work fits in with the critical realism, because the two Wengrows in the forthcoming book, they spend a lot of time talking about science and the value of science, and they're proponents of science, but they're also incredibly critical of science when it's ideology. And I think one of the main arguments that they're trying to make is that one of the reasons why society has gotten stuck in this capitalist mode of production is the false assumption that technology is an independent variable, and that it's very easy for people to think that in terms of the evolution of humanity, the stages of development, that they correspond to certain technologies. And what the two Davids are arguing is that people can creatively refuse certain technologies, and Wengrow's work shows this, that mass production existed during the Neolithic era, but that the implications of mass production were considered to be dangerous, and so they were well aware of what that could mean and would creatively refuse some of those implications because of the impact that it would have on society. And so I think, yeah, I think this could be a really helpful place, especially since, you know, when I was trained in history, you know, I was trained during the Gramsci years where everything was like resistance. And I would love to think through the distinctions between resistance and creative refusal, because I don't think Wengrow and Graeber are using them interchangeably. I think creative refusal means something quite different than just resistance. And so that's something that I would love to give some thought to. Okay, all right. So yeah, I guess on the 19th then, creative refusal, and we'll start putting together the other things, and we'll go from there. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.